Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, my dear students. I hope you are enjoying our course, our discussion on macroeconomics, and we discussed some pretty important things in our previous 2-3 lectures, and I hope that you've been able to absorb most of it. Now, I was discussing with my friends last night, and they asked me what I was lecturing you bright students on these days. And I had told them about the determination of income and output, and I said that I was teaching them about the multiplier and the accelerator. We will discuss the accelerator today. And they said that you economists try to make simple things complicated for nothing. So you try to make life difficult for all of us. They said, why do you have to come up with terms like multiplier and accelerator when you can make do with simpler terminology? Why can't you simply say that an increase in investment will cause expenditure or income to rise by more than the amount that investment has risen? Why do you have to introduce terms like multiplier and accelerator, which complicate things? And, well, the only response I had for him was that economics has become like a science, like any other science out there. So imagine how difficult it would be for, let's say, a scientist to talk about the electron if every time he had to refer to the electron as a tiny small particle with a negative charge which orbits the nucleus of an atom. How difficult would it be? Similarly, economists have tried to use vocabulary wherever possible to make things simpler, to make concepts easier to refer to. And this is necessary for any field, for research in any field to go forward. The point that I'm trying to make is that sometimes this new vocabulary that is thrown on you might feel like a burden on yourselves. But it is very important for you to become comfortable with it. Spend some time becoming comfortable with this vocabulary, with using this vocabulary. Because as you go further and further into the study of economics, the vocabulary becomes more and more important. It's part and parcel of expressing yourself, expressing your views, your opinions. So whatever theory, whatever idea you have in your mind should be articulated in the vocabulary of economics. Now, with that small message, let's now do a little recap on what we discussed in our previous lecture. Now, we've been talking about the determination of income and output in a Keynesian world. We looked at the major variables that were at play. We talked about income, consumption, saving, investment, taxes, government spending, imports, and exports. I think there are 8 in all. And we said that the interaction of these variables gives rise to the 4 problems that we talked about: unemployment, inflation, growth or the lack of growth, and balance of payments problems. However, we started by focusing on just 3 of those 8 variables. That is, we focused on consumption, we focused on investment, and we focused on net exports, which are actually 2 variables, exports and imports. And we saw how the interaction or how a better understanding of these variables enabled us then to understand how income was determined in any economy. We looked at 2 approaches for determination of total output in an economy. The first approach was the withdrawals and injections approach. This was the Keynesian view on equilibrium output. That is, equilibrium is reached when total withdrawals, that is the sum of savings, taxes, and imports, equals total injections, that is the sum of investment, government spending, and exports. That was one view of equilibrium. But we used some algebra to derive the other way to look at equilibrium. That was when Y equaled C plus I plus G plus net exports. And we used the 2 approaches through real data. We applied them to real data, hypothetical data, but they could be real data for any economy. And we saw how the equilibrium level of output would obtain in any economy. Now, when we approached the problem of output determination graphically, we introduced the famous 45-degree line diagram approach. And that diagram was simply plotting the aggregate demand function in expenditure output space. And we drew a 45-degree line in the middle which had a slope of 1, which represented the combination of all points at which total expenditure was equal to total output. And the point at which the total expenditure line, the y is equal to c plus I plus g plus nx line, intersected with the 45-degree line was the point at which the economy would be in equilibrium. Now remember that we said nothing about whether this equilibrium would be the optimal equilibrium or whether it would be not the optimal equilibrium. We just said this is the point at which the economy would operate at. So it is entirely possible for the equilibrium to be below the full employment level of output. We also looked at the withdrawals and injections approach. Again, we drew diagrams. We drew the injections line, which was a horizontal line, and the withdrawals line, which was an upward sloping line. And it was upward sloping because of the relationship between savings and incomes. As the income of an individual increases, he is likely to save more. Therefore, as we move further and further to the right on the horizontal axis, savings were expected to rise, and this caused an increase in the withdrawals function. And again, output was determined at their intersection, the intersection of the W and J lines, and again the answer would exactly be the same as was obtained in the first case. Now, one important point that we noted about this analysis was that in a Keynesian world, any small increase in the aggregate expenditure, caused either by an increase in autonomous investment or an increase in net exports or an increase in government expenditure, that would cause the expenditure line to shift upwards, would cause a multiplicative effect on income and output. And in our particular example, we saw that the increase of 10 billion in government spending or investment caused an output impact of $50 billion. That is, the multiplier in this case was equal to 5. So that is when we introduced the Keynesian multiplier, which we defined as simply equal to 1 over 1 minus MPC, where MPC was the marginal propensity to consume. Now, those were the basic ideas that we developed in our previous lecture. There are many ways in which equilibrium can be viewed, and the output expenditure method and the withdrawal injections methods are just two methods. Remember, earlier we used to talk about equilibrium in the context of aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves, right? And some of you might be wondering, where the hell have those curves gone? Let's now take a look at it, where they have gone and whether we can bring them back into the analysis. Now, when we talked about the aggregate demand and aggregate supply approach, we basically said that the intersection of those two curves will determine the equilibrium point for any economy. And this is consistent with the earlier approach to equilibrium that we developed in our microeconomics lectures. That is simply the intersection of any demand and supply curves in any market would determine the equilibrium level of output and prices, or equilibrium level of quantity in that market. So the same principle applies to the aggregate economy or the macroeconomy as a whole as well. But it's useful to try to understand how the 45-degree line approach relates to the aggregate demand, aggregate supply approach to the determination of equilibrium. Surely, there should be a relationship. Let's illustrate through some graphs what this relationship is, and I'm sure this will reassure you further. Let's go to our first slide. Now, in these two graphs, the one on top and the one on bottom, we try to establish the relationship between the 45-degree line approach and the aggregate demand, aggregate supply approaches. Now, let's first look at the bottom diagram. This is the simple, typical diagram of income output determination using the 45-degree line approach. Let's start with the equilibrium point where the y curve, that is the slope 45-degree line curve, the one unity slope line, intersects the expenditure curve, that is E1. That point delivers an equilibrium output of YE1, right? Now, if you take this diagram to the top and look at what's happening in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram in PY space, then you can see that this point of equilibrium YE1 takes place at the intersection point of the aggregate demand curve 1 and the aggregate supply curve. We've assumed the horizontal portion of the aggregate supply curve because if you remember, the income output method approach only talks about when prices are fixed, that is where slack is available in the economy. Now what happens when the expenditure function shifts vertically upwards, right? And we move to equilibrium output level YE2. Now how would this be reflected in the top diagram? Note that this would be reflected by a rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve. The curve shifts from AD1 to AD2 to deliver the same new equilibrium level of output and income, YE2. Now, where is the multiplier effect showing here? Well, the multiplier effect in the bottom graph, as you all know, is quite simple to see. You can see that the vertical rise in the expenditure function is quite small, but the horizontal increase in the output, equilibrium output, is quite large. And it is this ratio of the horizontal distance and the vertical increase in the expenditure function that determines the size of the multiplier. Now, how is this reflected in the top graph? Well, it is simply reflected by the horizontal distance that the aggregate demand curve shifts by. So, note that the vertical distance between E1 and E2 is still quite small, but the aggregate demand function shifts by the same distance that the equilibrium output shifts by. And so this is capturing the multiplier effect of the small increase, vertical increase in the expenditure function. Now, by answering that question about whether there is a relationship between the ADAS graph and the income output graph, the expenditure output graph, that is the 45-degree line graph, by answering that question, I hope I have planted another question in your mind. And this is the beauty of economics, that as each question is answered, more and more questions come up in your mind. So if you're now thinking, what happens to the ADAS graph when you are in the realm of the upward sloping supply curve, that is beyond the level of full employment, and how would this be reflected in the 45-degree line approach? Note that so far we've assumed in the 45-degree line diagram that we are operating on the horizontal part of the aggregate supply curve. That is, demand determines supply. What happens when you introduce the possibility of a rise in prices as aggregate demand increases? Let's look at this through another set of diagrams. The key thing to remember is that the 45-degree line approach gives the level of output which is the equilibrium level of output, but this may not necessarily be the full employment level of output. So in this diagram you can see that there are points where the YF, that is the full employment level of income or output, is less than the YE or the equilibrium level of income and output. For example, YF1 is one such point. Now the vertical distance between the aggregate demand function or the aggregate expenditure line and the 45-degree line at a point such as, or a vertical extension of a point such as YF1, is called the inflationary gap. This means that the excess of aggregate expenditures or aggregate demand over the aggregate output is causing an upward pressure on prices because the economy is operating at a level which is higher than the full employment level. In this particular case, the inflationary gap is 30 billion, which is the vertical distance between the aggregate expenditure line and the 45-degree line. $30 billion then is the amount by which expenditures must fall. If it is government expenditures that the government can choose to reduce, then that is it what must fall in order to bring the economy back to the full employment level of output. Now let's see how the same thing can be represented in the ADAS curve. And this should be familiar to you because we've talked about these things before. That is, what happens when the demand curve shifts and you are on the upward sloping part of the aggregate supply curve. Now, as you can see here, the figure shows an equilibrium level of output Y star for aggregate demand line AD prime. A $10 billion increase in investment spending or government spending will shift the aggregate spending line upwards to AD double prime. This will be reflected by a horizontal movement of $50 billion if the multiplier is 5, and that is what the multiplier was in our example. So the 10 billion increase in investment causes a 50 billion rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve. However, since the aggregate supply curve is positively sloped, the increased spending does not fully translate into increases in output. What happens? The price level rises, which decreases consumption, investment, and net export spending due to wealth, interest rate, and international purchasing power effects. And if you remember, we covered these effects earlier on. The combined effect of these wealth, interest rate, and international purchasing power effects will reduce the effect of the multiplier on the output, which will now rise only to Y star plus 40 compared to the earlier rise of phi star plus 50 billion if the aggregate supply curve had been horizontal. So equilibrium now moves from E prime to E triple prime, not to E double prime, which is what would have obtained if the aggregate supply curve were horizontal. And the reason why a smaller increase in output is being obtained is because the price level has risen from P1 to P2 and caused those three effects, the wealth, interest rate, and international purchasing power effects. Now let's move to another argument that Keynes put forward. We've concluded discussion on the relationships between the AD-AS and income output approaches. So we can now move to some more dimensions of the Keynes classicals debate, which we can help illustrate through the concepts that we've learned, the concept of the multiplier, for example. Let's see one such concept, which is, or this is called the paradox of thrift by Keynes. If you don't understand what these terms mean, let me try to explain them to you. Thrift basically means prudence, being careful about spending your money. So if some person earns, let's say, 100 rupees, but he's very careful about how he spends that money, in fact, he tries to spend as little as possible, यानी कि बड़ा कंजूस है और अपनी जेब में ही रखता है, तो you will call that person is thrifty. Paradox basically means something that is difficult to resolve. That is, if you expect something to happen but something else happens, then that is called a paradox. This is just one definition which I think will do in this particular case. And what I've said, what I've sort of written below, which is when prudence is folly, this is Keynes's argument that he said that it is possible for the economy to be in a state where if all the individuals in the economy are being very prudent about their expenditure decisions, that is, they are thrifty, they are all thrifty, this can actually be collective foolishness or collective folly, and it can lead to the collective detriment of everyone in the economy. Now, this was a pretty powerful argument. Let me first tell you what the classical view was about thriftiness or saving, the need to save in the economy. Now, classical economists considered saving as a big virtue of societies. They said it's very important for people to save because the more they save, the more will the saving curve shift to the right in the loanable funds market graph, if you recall. And the more the saving curve shifts to the right, the lower the interest rate will be. The lower the interest rate is, the higher will be investment. Firms will be able to borrow funds more cheaply from banks, and therefore they will be able to finance more investment. And the more investment takes place in the economy, the higher will be the growth rate. So saving really was the engine of growth for these classical economists. Now what Keynes argued was that while saving from an individual point of view might carry a lot of benefits for a person, that is, if you save for a rainy day, then come that rainy day and you still have that money to utilize. So for example, if you get 100 rupees and you had the choice to spend it all, let's say, on a dinner, but you did not, you saved that money, then that saved money will enable you to sustain higher expenditures at a time when you do not have income coming from other sources. So while saving can help individuals at a micro level, but Keynes said that it is possible for the economy as a whole to suffer if everybody starts saving. That is, if everybody starts reducing his or her expenditure, then the economy as a whole can suffer. And this is where he illustrated the paradox of thrift. Let's now illustrate it through the use of a simple diagram. Now we can illustrate the paradox of thrift using the withdrawals injections approach to output determination. As you can see, we've drawn this diagram in Wj and Y space. So we have withdrawals and injections on the vertical axis and the output on the horizontal axis. Now, how do you illustrate the paradox of thrift? Imagine if people suddenly or generally start saving more, that is, they make this choice that they want to save more for a rainy day or something else, then the withdrawals function will shift upwards, because savings are one form of a withdrawal. They are a leakage from the circular flow of income, and therefore the size of the withdrawals would increase. This means that the withdrawal function W1 will rise to W2. However, as people save more, they will naturally be able to spend less. As you know, you can only do two things with your income. You can either save or you can spend. That is, you can either consume. So if you save more, then you can obviously consume less. And if you consume less, then firms will be able to produce less. That is, they will be able to sell less. There will thus be a multiplied fall in income. The phenomenon of higher savings leading to lower national income is known as the paradox of thrift. That is, the movement from point C to point A in this diagram, that is from output level YE1 to YE2, shows the paradox of thrift. That is, the disadvantages of being overly prudent. But this is not all. Far from the extra savings encouraging more investment, the lower consumption will discourage firms from investing. So if investment falls, the J line will shift downwards as well. In this particular case, the J line could shift to something like J prime. There will then be a further multiplied fall in national income, leading the economy from point A to point K. And the output, the equilibrium level of output, would be YE3. So that was one additional dimension of Keynes's argument. As you can see, through all these different arguments, Keynes was advocating the case of fiscal policy expansion in situations of recession. That is, he was arguing for more spending, more injections into the economy, more injections of demand, so that the economy could come out of recession. And he was enunciating the negative impact that withdrawals or more saving behavior could have on the intensity of the recession. So that was one, the paradox of thrift. The other thing that I want to talk about is the accelerator. We've talked about the multiplier. We also now must talk about the Keynesian accelerator. It's also called the investment accelerator. Now, in our earlier discussion on investment, we noted that investment was far more volatile than output or income. Remember that graph when we saw that the peaks in the investment movement, the movement of investment in the US, were far more sharp and pronounced than the peaks and troughs for the output changes. Now, this instability of investment is at the heart of the accelerator principle, and the two are imbricately linked. What is this relationship? Now, one obvious relationship that we know from our discussion on multiplier between output and investment is that as investment increases, the output or expenditure expands with a multiplied effect, because investment represents an injection into the economy. However, the observation that Keynes made was that whenever output increases, or there is a growth in the rate of the growth rate of output expands or increases, then the level of investment, the rate of change of investment becomes very, very high. That is, if let's say output increases by 2%, then investment can go up by 10%. And this was what he called the accelerator principle. That is, a 2% increase in output causes a 10 or 15% or 12% or 6% increase in investment. And then because investment was an injection, then whatever was added to investment caused a multiplicative effect on the income or the equilibrium expenditure. So you can imagine that together the multiplier and the accelerator could have enormous impact on the equilibrium level of output and income. So you could start with a government spending injection that could cause output to expand, including investment demand could pick up. Once investment demand picked up, and this increase would be higher than the increase in output because of the accelerator effect, once the investment demand or investment picked up, this would then cause multiplicative effects on the income in turn, which would then further induce rises in investment demand, which would be caused by the accelerator principle, and therefore this cycle could go on forever. So in a way, if the multiplier and accelerator were working together, higher incomes causing higher investment, causing higher incomes, causing further higher investments, the output level could explode. That is, the economy would go through the roof. Is it possible? Well, there are two things to note here. First of all, it's not possible for the economy to grow without limits. That is, the economy will eventually face the ceiling of full employment. After a while, you can't increase output because the number of workers in the economy is limited. After a while, firms can't increase their output because the amount of capital that they can buy is limited. So there is that ceiling. But even if that ceiling were not there, it is not likely that investment and output can go on increasing forever and ever. Now, the reason for this is that investment is not related to the level of output. It is related to the change in output. So in order for investment to increase through the accelerator effect, it requires the change in output to be positive throughout. So for example, if output expands today by 2%, investment might go up by 10%. But if tomorrow output expands by only 1%, then investment will not go up by 10%. It will go up by less. It might actually fall. So in order to have permanent or continuous changes in investment, you need permanent changes or permanently positive growth rates, permanently increasing growth rates in output. And the reason for this, if you remember, why is this that the permanent increase in investment is linked to the permanent increase in growth rates? The reason for this is that income, the level of income in the economy, is not a determinant of investment. If you remember our brief discussion on investment, we discussed a number of determinants of investment. We discussed the 4 categories of investment: housing construction, non-housing construction, capital goods purchases, changes in business inventories, and we introduced a number of determinants. But the level of income in the economy was not there, right? Changes in income, expected changes in income can affect investment levels, investment decisions, but not the level of income. So this is how we can explain that the accelerator and multiplicative effects that can be caused by investment and then through the multiplier cannot go on forever, because output cannot expand forever. Now, in order to make that a little bit more clear to you, let me give you a small example. Think of a situation in which the output of the economy is not growing. What will happen to investment? What will be happening to investment in this state? Well, investment will happen, but only to the extent that depreciated capital is to be replaced. That is, the machinery which has depreciated or not become usable, that has to be replaced. But firms will not be investing in new plants, new machinery, because they don't expect output to grow. What happens if output falls? If output falls, then investment can go really down. That is, again, a small trough in output can cause a huge drop in investment. So similarly, when we talk about what would happen to investment and output if the economy was increasing, economy was expanding, we need to look at what would happen to the growth rate of the economy. Eventually, the growth rate of the economy would stop, and this is the time where the change in investment would stop. That is, investment would become stable. Then as soon as the growth rate of the economy retarded or became negative, investment would start falling, and in a very rapid way. And that would trigger the multiplier effect. So the multiplier effect sort of works both ways. When investment rises, it causes output to expand multiplicatively. But when investment falls, that also causes output to contract multiplicatively. Right? Now, let's do two things. Let's first develop or formalize our understanding of the accelerator algebraically, and then let's show the interaction of the accelerator and multiplier through a simple table. Let's go to our slides. Now, as we noted earlier, investment depends on changes in income, not the level of income, but changes in income, that is delta Y. So we can simply write I is equal to alpha delta Y, where alpha is the amount by which investment depends on changes in national income. To be specific, I here represents induced investment, that is the investment which responds to income. Alpha is known as the accelerator coefficient. Thus, if a £1 million rise in the national income causes the level of induced investment to be £2 million, then the accelerator coefficient would be 2. The size of alpha will depend on the economy's marginal capital output ratio, that is delta K over delta Y. This is the cost of extra capital required to produce a £1 increase in national output. Thus, if an increase in the country's capital stock of $2 million or £2 million, that is the investment is £2 million, is required to produce £1 million extra national output, then the marginal capital output ratio would be 2. It is easy to see that the accelerator coefficient and the marginal capital output ratio are essentially the same. Now, what can we say about the value of alpha? Why could alpha take a value of 2 or 3 and not a value of 0.1 or 0.2? Well, the answer to that is that a machine may last several years and may have a value considerably in excess of 1 year's output. So as a consumer demand rises, a firm might actually buy a machine, that is, might invest in capital which is much more than that required to produce the output just for that year. Therefore, the delta K, that is the increase in capital stock, might be many times the increase in output or the required increase in output. Now, let me explain this delicate point to you about the value that the accelerator coefficient can take in a little bit more detail. Consider a firm which has one plant, right? And the plant produces, let's say, 100 cars annually, right? Suddenly, the demand for cars doubles in that area. So people want 200 cars. First, the firm was producing 100 cars. Now the demand increases to 200 cars. Now the firm can start a new plant, right? It can start or begin a new plant which can also produce 100 cars, and that will be enough to serve the demand of the consumers. However, the plant that the firm sets up, that is the plant which can produce 100 more cars, will not only be able to produce the 100 cars that the consumers need in this particular year, but it might be capable of producing 100 cars for 10 years, right? So any plant which can produce 100 cars for 10 years is likely to cost much more than the value of simply those 100 cars that it can produce in 1 year. So think of the plant as something which enables the firm to produce 1,000 cars, that is 10 times 100, right? So the value of the plant will be much higher than simply the increase in output that is required to meet the increased demand just for that year. This is why when the firm decides to set up the new plant, it actually undertakes a capital expenditure which is much larger than the increase in output that would be needed to satisfy the increased demand. So this is why the accelerator coefficient is usually greater than 1. Now that is rested. Now let's look at the interaction between the multiplier and accelerator. We mentioned this earlier. Let's now summarize this through a nice, neat table. Now, to illustrate the process of interaction between the multiplier and the accelerator more formally, consider the sequence of events in this table that is shown. An initial upsurge or increase in injections in period T leads to a cumulative increase in income as the multiplier and accelerator effects interact, right? But by the time the economy has reached period 2, it is no longer certain that the economy will go on growing. Investment will only rise in period T plus 2 if national income grew more in period T plus 1 than it did in period T. Now things like the interaction between the accelerator and the multiplier are not simple. They are quite complex. And therefore, it is very important that after this lecture, you go home or go into your study rooms and look at the table again, look at the ways in which these different demand components and income interact. Note that in discussing the interaction of the accelerator and multiplier, we are talking about the direction of causality. Direction of causality simply relates to the fact that which variable is causing changes in which variable. So when you're talking about the multiplier effect, then any increase in investment will cause a change in output. So the direction of causality runs from investment to output. But when you talk about the accelerator, that is changes in output causing firms to invest more and more, then you're talking about reverse causality. That is, the direction of causality runs from output to investment. So try to get comfortable with these different interactions, because later on when we talk about the relationships between some of the key macroeconomic problems and variables, then the direction of causality, the discussion about that will become very, very important. So, my friends, that concludes our discussion on the determination of income and equilibrium income and employment in a Keynesian setup. We've talked about the multiplier, the accelerator, some of the related ideas that Keynes put forward, the paradox of thrift, etc., and they're all very useful, very important. Now, with that understanding at the back of our minds, we are now in a position to deal with the four big problems that we identified at the start of the course and at the start of the macroeconomics module. That were unemployment, inflation, growth, and balance of payments problems. And this is the order in which I hope to deal with these four problems. At least I want to start out with unemployment and inflation, because these two are quite nicely related together, and we'll bring out their relationship as we go along. Now, when we start discussion on any one of these four problems, these are fundamentally important problems in macroeconomics. Let's say we want to start discussion on unemployment. Then the order in which you should try to approach this topic could be as follows. First of all, you need to understand what the problem means, right? You need to understand what unemployment means. Once you've understood that, then it's important to look at the costs of unemployment. That why do we want to concern ourselves with this issue? How is this issue important? What are the problems that it causes for the society as a whole or for individuals? So you need to talk about the costs of the problem, in this case, unemployment. After discussing that, you turn to the causes of unemployment. And usually this is the stage where the different theories put forward by different economists come into play. We look at the different views on what causes unemployment. There are usually two views at least, one sort of inspired by Keynesian ideas and one inspired by classical ideas. But there are other ideas as well. For example, in the case of unemployment, I think there are three major ideas, and we'll discuss those in order. So remember, you define the problem, you understand what it means, then you look at what its costs are, then you look at what causes this problem, what are the causes of this problem. Once you've identified the causes, you can then suggest appropriate policies for the removal of those causes, right? You cannot address a problem, that is, you cannot devise policy for sorting out a problem until you know what is causing it. So therefore, the study of the causes must come before you suggest solutions. So this is the order in which we will approach all of these problems, including that of unemployment. So let's start by first looking at the history of unemployment in general and what it means. Now, let me first clarify one thing before we go to the history of unemployment, is that why are we studying unemployment ahead of the other three problems, that is growth or the lack of growth, inflation and balance of payments problems? The main reason is that macroeconomics was born out of a controversy on how to deal with the unemployment problem. And we spent a lot of time on this in our introduction to macroeconomics lectures. We looked at the problem, the great problem that advanced countries at that time faced, the great problem of unemployment. Unemployment rates were as high as 25% in 1933, which was huge and unprecedented in North America and Western Europe. And then we had these rival views, the classical economists' views and the Keynesian view on how the unemployment problem could be solved, what were the causes of unemployment. And this is actually really where macroeconomics was born. So we owe our present sort of understanding of macroeconomics, or the reason that we are studying macroeconomics, to the problem of unemployment. Had it not been for the problem of unemployment, who knows how macroeconomics would have evolved. So that's why we are starting out with unemployment. Now, as for the history of unemployment, you should remember that the main problem in the 1930s was when there was very high unemployment because of the Great Depression. This was then followed by the Second World War. Now, the Second World War brought in a lot of destruction, but it removed the demand problems that persisted during the times of the recession, that is late 1920s and early 1930s. And military spending by government created jobs for many people, and therefore the focus sort of shifted from the unemployment problems that were so marked during the early 1930s. Now, in the 1950s and 60s, there was a lot of reconstruction in Europe, in North America, not in North America, but in Europe and, let's say, Japan. And therefore, unemployment problems were generally quite low because there was a lot of economic activity, capital stock was being rebuilt, factories were being rebuilt, schools were being rebuilt, the destruction of war was being undone. And therefore, a lot of jobs were created, and unemployment problems really remained quite low during the 1950s and 60s. Now, this situation changed in the 1970s. The 1970s saw the two oil price increases. The first one in 1974, and the second one in 1979. And the increase in the oil price was a major shock, a supply-side shock for the world. It caused two things. It caused prices of production to increase, costs of transport to rise, right? So it caused a sort of an inward shift in the supply curve. But it also caused recession. There were a lot of layoffs, firms reduced their investment levels, businesses laid off workers, retired them, and therefore there were a lot of people unemployed as well. So there was a state of recession as well. That is, the aggregate demand curve had also sort of shifted in. And this caused the situation which we described as stagflation. That is, prices were rising because the costs of production had increased, but unemployment was high. So unemployment really raised its head again in the 1970s, and the problems were compounded in the early 1980s when the world formally found itself in the second major recession after the Great Depression of the 1930s. So the early 80s saw the debt crisis in Latin America and many developing countries, and we'll talk about the debt crisis later on when we talk about balance of payments problems. But the problem of unemployment raised its head in the early 1980s. In the latter part of the 1980s, the problem subsided again because activity gradually picked up, the world came out of recession. Then again in the early 1990s, there was a world recession, a mild world recession, and unemployment sort of became higher as well. The problem again reappeared. Then again towards the end of the 1990s, the rise of the new economy in the United States, the IT revolution, the information technology revolution that all of you are fully aware about, caused a lot of new jobs to be created, new businesses to be launched, and therefore unemployment fell to record lows in the US and many Western European and other countries. However, since the turn of the millennium and the events of September 11th, the world has again been plunged into a mild recession. It could go worse as well, but only time will tell whether it does or not. And so unemployment is again being talked about in many of the higher income countries. Now, as regards the lower income countries, the problem has sometimes been very intense in certain countries and has actually not been a problem in others. So if you look at East Asian countries, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, which have grown very fast and created jobs much faster than the rate of population, unemployment has not really been a problem there. But for countries like Pakistan, India, African countries where the population growth rate was quite high, eventually the number of people looking for jobs became so large that it sort of highlighted or increased the problem of unemployment due to the sheer size of the population. Although these problems can go away again because of an increase in potential GDP growth in the economy, but the level of the problem has varied immensely across countries because of the difference between the real GDP growth rate and the rate of growth of population. Now, with that history of unemployment at the back of your minds, we can now move to a study of how unemployment is defined and how it is measured. So what is the meaning of unemployment? When we said that in Western Europe at the time of the Great Depression and in North America, the unemployment rate was as high as 25%, what does this 25% or what did this 25% really mean? Did it mean that 25% of the population in these countries was unemployed? Was that what the meaning of 25% was? Well, clearly, it would be wrong to just take the number of all the people who are not working and divide it by the total size of the population. That is, let's say if there are 100 people in an economy and 75 people are not working, and if you divide 75 by 100, that could give you an unemployment rate of 75%. But would that be the correct way to approach unemployment? No. Because not all the people in your total population are actually able or willing to work. So think about children. 40 or 30 or 45% of the sort of population in, let's say, Pakistan is based on sort of children, people or children between the ages of, let's say, 1 and 15. Now, if you have such high part of your total population as children, then you need to take this part out in your calculation when you calculate the unemployment rate. Also, think about elders, people who have retired or people who are so old that they can't do a job, right? Also think of people who are incapacitated, people who are chronically ill or terminally ill and can't work. Also think about all the women who are giving birth to children, who are busy raising children in the house or looking after the house and can't offer to work on the job market, right? So all these categories of population of people need to be taken out when you are trying to develop a measure for unemployment. So here is where we need to introduce the concept of the labor force. The labor force is simply a summation of all those individuals in the population who are able and willing to work. That is, who offer themselves on the job market, who are looking for jobs, right? This is defined as the labor force. Now we have to see how many people out of this labor force are employed and how many people are unemployed. Now, if we divide the number of unemployed people in the labor force by the size of the total labor force, we will get a measure of the unemployment rate, right? So, if the total size of the labor force, let's say, is 100 and the number of people who are unemployed are 20 out of that labor force, then the unemployment rate will be simply 20 divided by 100, that is 20%. So this is just to put the definition of unemployment into the right context. Now, once we've developed this nice ratio definition of unemployment, we can then compare the unemployment problem across different countries. In our next lecture, we will take our discussion of unemployment from here. We will talk about the costs of unemployment. We'll talk about the causes of unemployment, the three views on unemployment, the monetarist view, the classical view, and the Keynesian view. And we'll tackle the policy implications or the policy recommendations that each of these views suggests. So till then, till our next lecture, it is Khuda Hafiz, mere dosto, or Assalamu alaikum.